Some amazing content about coffee for you to enjoy and consume. And if you're going to consume something, you should consume some Baca. And up next, we got Chris Baca. He's going to be talking about his approach to espresso. If you don't know who Chris Baca is, shame on you. One of the founders of Cat and Cloud and a long history in coffee. He's been doing some amazing stuff for a very long time, and he has been so kind to share some of that with us today. So put your hands together for Mr. Chris Baca.
Oh, hey. I have this little clicker thing. Neat. Thanks everyone for coming. So they talked to me and they said, do you want to do a little something for Welcome Home? Specifically geared towards the home barista or beginner barista or someone who maybe doesn't make espresso as their profession. And I said, absolutely yes, that would be fantastic. And I put something together, and then I got here, and then I realized that probably 9 out of 10 people who are sitting in these chairs here are absolutely not home baristas at all, if I'm right. So who is some sort of professional barista or works? Yeah, there's lots of them. That's a home barista right there, I know that for sure. How many other home people are here? All right, there are a few. Yeah. So I'm gonna deviate a little bit from what I've talked about, and I'm gonna start with just a little bit of training philosophy, which I think can be useful for someone who's starting to make espresso or starting to make coffee at home, but is also useful for someone who teaches other people espresso. Even if you have a really, really large company, you're cranking out a ton of baristas, you have really fancy equipment, you have really advanced ways to control all aspects of espresso brewing. What we're going to talk about today is kind of like where we start everyone, regardless of skill, experience. So there are some ideas here that I maybe just take and sit with them for a little bit and just see how you feel about it later, even if you don't like it right now. So the first thing that I just really want to look at is this guy. This is my friend Albert. He's like a really cool guy. He did a lot of really cool things. And this quote right here, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. This is kind of the idea that we base all of our training around. And you can take this idea and run with it in coffee, milk steaming, espresso, brewed coffee, whatever you want to do. Espresso is one of those things that has the reputation for being insanely complicated. And on some level, it actually is. And to maximize what we want to do, if we want to be the best of the best of the best, we do have to control these really tiny details and maximize these little details. But the problem is a lot of people who are really passionate about these things and understand a lot of these details just kind of take someone who's a new trainee, they got all this knowledge and it's kind of bumbled up in their head and it's flying around and they know stuff about water temperature, pressure, TDS, solubility, extraction percentages, and then somebody new comes to the company or somebody who just has a home espresso machine, wants to learn how to make good coffee, and they're like, how do I make good coffee? And the person's like, blah, and just barfs out all of this knowledge. And it's definitely a case of TMI, or too much information. There's no way for someone who's new to be able to process all of these little complex things. And this is the wrong way to approach training. So we want to focus on taking like the biggest bites out of the espresso game, or the biggest bites out of the milk game, or whatever it is we're teaching, in order to get this person from here to here. And then once they're here, we can worry about getting them, you know, here and here and here and here and here and here. Has anybody heard of like the 80-20 principle, the Pareto principle? You know, 80% of the results come from 20% of the efforts. Same thing applies here. So when you're thinking about training, don't think about it as what do I know and what can I teach and what can I tell this person? The way that we're always going to think about it is, how can I help this person take the next biggest step in whatever their journey is? So it's just really, really important to keep that in mind. If this person's never touched an espresso machine before, if they've never made coffee, and you're talking to them about TDS or extraction percentages, you're definitely wasting your time, you're definitely confusing them, and they're gonna be worse because of it. So those things are important, but they're important later on. Also, as a side note, if anybody has any questions, we can just like fire them out here and just go for it. So feel free to be like, hey, I want to talk about this thingy. Espresso is really, really, really easy. You don't have a lot of ingredients. You've got coffee that's ground, and you've got water, and you're putting water and mixing it with this ground coffee, and this thing comes out, and then you can drink it. You've got some other things going on, you know, you've got some pressure, you've got some temperature, you've got whatever, but it's really, really not that important. And this ties in to the idea of simplifying training is whatever you're going to teach someone to do, you need to let them know that they can do it. So they need to feel like when they walk into the room, like, hey, guess what? At the end of the day, when we leave here in 3 hours, you're gonna make espresso that you can drink and it's gonna be good. And that is huge. And I used to do it the other way around, and I used to have like really bad training sessions because I would approach it the other way. People would come in and I was just like really passionate about this product and I knew all these little details. So people would come in and be like, okay guys, here's the thing. Espresso is really, really, really hard. It's really complex and there's all these little details and you're not gonna get it all today and it's maybe gonna take months and then maybe in 2 years you'll be like a pretty okay barista or something like that. And what I found was we would leave trainings and people would just, they didn't really say anything, but they had these kind of sad looks on their faces. They're like, yeah, I just had training, 3 hours, Baca. Like, was it good? I don't know. It's like, espresso's hard. I'm not gonna do it. And aside from being really defeating in that initial training, it also made every other training a little bit less successful because they just kind of felt like they were getting further into this rabbit hole and learning more about something that they could never attain. So we take the opposite approach now and we make espresso easy. Before you teach anything, I think this is like a huge mental shift that you can apply for all of your teaching and get really, really, really awesome results. If someone makes an espresso at the end of their first training session, let's say they've never touched an espresso machine before, you spend 3 hours with them and they make espresso that's good, they should feel really awesome about themselves. You should congratulate them on that, and you should absolutely not focus on the things that they need to do next time, or like, yeah, this is pretty good, but here's like 15 other things that you're gonna learn over the next 3 months that are gonna make this really awesome. Because again, that's not helpful, it's not empowering, it's just defeating and frustrating. So, espresso is easy. Everything is easy. There's all these little weird things, but we're gonna look at these things. So these are things that I like to call the big four, and they're applicable to espresso, but they're applicable to any kind of just normal coffee brewing if we're talking about pour over, or making a French press, or making an AeroPress. And these are the 4 largest things that baristas can easily, easily manipulate. So the more you know about coffee, the more you know that there are so many more things that can affect the quality of your coffee. So things that you might not see on there are things like water temperature isn't on there, water quality isn't on there, pressure isn't on there. There's this huge list of things that aren't really on there. And the reason that they're not on there is twofold. The first reason is because a lot of people don't have access to change those things or to be able to affect those things. So let's take water temperature for an example. Brew water temperature is absolutely important, but if you get hired on as a barista at a cafe, you go through basic training, if you step onto the bar, 9 times out of 10, you're not really empowered to be like, oh, my coffee's tasting a little bit weird. Let me just bump this thing to, 201.5 or 202, or maybe you're doing espresso at home, and depending on what level of equipment you have, you don't have a PID on your machine, you don't have a lot of control over what water temperature you have, so you kind of just have to work with what you have, and that's totally fine. Pressure is another one. If you have an espresso machine and you run the standard 9 bars, there's no reason to think about how good my coffee would be if I did have this pressure profiling machine and I could run crazy profiles. It's just not immediately useful. It's not a big chunk, but not first. So these are the 4 main aspects that are always in any barista's direct control. So they are, number 1, the dose or the input, how much ground coffee you're using to make an espresso. The second one is your yield or your output. How large is the coffee that you're making? How many grams is the output of your espresso? Number 3, how long it's being brewed for. And number 4, you have the grind setting. Anybody who has basic espresso tools can manipulate all of these things. And this is the only thing you really need to manipulate to get really, 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 really good espresso. This is going to get you into that 80th plus percentile of I'm making badass coffee and it tastes delicious. Man down. So some of these things form what we'll call a recipe. And a recipe looks something like this. And if we're starting with espresso, we're going to start with some sort of recipe. You can think about it as a formula, or you can think about it as, analogous to if you're baking something and you need certain amounts of flour, certain amounts of water, certain amounts of time in the oven, and that's going to get you a cake, or whatever. I don't bake. I'm absolutely horrible in the kitchen. I'll be the first to admit that. I got 2 really awesome cooks right here, though. Alex and Grace, raise your hand. They cook stuff. Now, the first thing that we'll talk about in regards to recipe, which applies to home baristas, but also baristas who have worked more than one job, is that there is no one recipe that always yields good results. Different coffees act differently depending on where they're from, how they're roasted, and even more importantly, style. Like, what is the intention of that coffee? So this ties into the idea that there is no one perfect espresso. There are lots of kinds of coffees, there are lots of kinds of espressos. There's a lot of beautiful flavors to be had in coffee. And where I see this a lot is someone worked at one cafe, they learn the gospel of that company, they go to work at another cafe, and they're like, 19 in, no, we did like 16 and a half in, like 8.5 bar extraction, like yeah, 33 out, that's not right, it's all about 40 plus out, or the opposite, like no, it's too big, it needs to be smaller. There is no one right recipe. And again, I think as an educator or someone who's working with other baristas on a regular basis, the way to approach this is that no one's right or wrong, and it's not about like, I worked here and they said this, and like, well, they're actually wrong and we're actually right. It's just like, yeah, they were totally right given the style of coffee that they wanted. We're trying to do something different, so in order to do something that's a little bit different style, we're gonna need to use a little bit of a different recipe. We're not better or worse than our colleagues, coworkers, competition, whatever you want to call it. We're just different. And if everybody made the exact same coffee, think about how boring the world would be. That would be an awful place to live in if I went to every cafe and got the same coffee everywhere. I'd be depressed. So we should celebrate some sort of diversity in this recipe and let people know, they're like, yeah, dude, it's cool that your experience was that. That's awesome, and I bet the coffee tasted awesome. This is what we're doing. Same thing applies in the home world, and you get on some forums or some home chat, and since as a home user, you may not have exposure to a lot of like the tools and a lot of the different styles that maybe you get from working in commercial environments for 10 plus years. People get really attached to these numbers and they're like, well, I heard that I can't really go lower than 20 grams, or I can't go more than 18 grams because it's too much for this portafilter, or like you can't go above 30-second extraction because that breaks the rules of that 25 to 30 seconds that I've been hearing my whole life. And really, it's all about taste, it's all about exploration, it's all about nailing what you want to do. So while this big part of the Big Four develops this recipe, you want to make your own recipe depending on what you want to taste. So there's only 3 of the Big Four that exist in the recipe. You've got your dose or your coffee in, your output, and your time frame. And then the grind setting is kind of like this weird unsung hero because he doesn't have any kind of useful number or value associated with him. So he's like kind of this mystery. But really the grind setting is just expressed through your flow rate. So depending on what grind setting you use, if you put a certain amount of coffee in, extract it evenly, get a certain amount of liquid out at a certain time frame, that's kind of where your grind setting lives. So it's kind of a bummer because it makes it a little bit more tricky, and it's not as easy as doing a batch brew and we can be like, hey, just set it to 6 and call it a day. It also brings up another really, really big problem, which is because there's no number for grind setting, and because we have this recipe that we want, we can kind of end up chasing the dragon a little bit. So to figure out how to chase this dragon, we need to look at like what's happening when water is going through the espresso puck. I talk about this a lot, and I'm really, really passionate about it, and it's the idea of getting an even extraction. And I think it's the most important thing that you can learn or be aware of when you're making espresso, because if you don't do this, no matter what you do, all of your coffee is going to taste bad, and your recipe is not going to give you any indication of what's happening. So let's just look at the diagrams. This is like a portafilter, You've probably seen this, maybe. I don't know, it's a portafilter. We're looking through it, and there's a little mass of packed coffee in there. So these little lines here represent the density of the mass of the coffee that's in there, right? And this would be a perfectly even distributed, perfectly even density cake of coffee, which is preferable. And you turn your pump on and water hits it, and then since the water has no choice but to go through the coffee at an even rate, you're gonna get what we call an even extraction. So everybody here is probably familiar with the idea of the water is going to take the path of least resistance. The water does not care that you're trying to make amazing coffee. It just wants to get through the coffee puck as easily as possible. It's the reason water flows like through the canyons in between the mountains and not over the top of them, because that would be too hard. So there's a couple ways that things can really go poorly. And this is the first way that things can go pretty poorly. You've got a coffee puck of really uneven density. You've got, for whatever reason, a lot of coffee on one side of the portafilter, or in one part of the portafilter. It doesn't have to be linear. And you've got relatively less coffee on the other side of the portafilter, or in another part of the portafilter. You turn your pump on, water starts to go into the puck of coffee. And because the density of the coffee is not even, you're gonna get a lot more water being pumped through one part of the coffee, and relatively less water going through another part of the coffee. And we're gonna get a discrepancy in extraction. So the water that's going, the big huge arrow, the big mass of water, that cross-section of what's being brewed is gonna taste radically different than the other section. And there's two reasons this is going to be bad. Is one, it's going to render your recipe basically useless. But on another end of the spectrum, when you get into actually tasting your coffee and you're trying to figure out what you need to do, the first step that you need to do is try to taste for extraction byproducts. Am I at some sort of optimum extraction? Am I under-extracted? Am I over-extracted? Just really, really basic. This is going to give you conflicting feedback. So you're going to taste some over-extraction, dryness, and bitterness from the part of the coffee bed that had like a ton of water pushed through it. And you're going to taste some over-extraction, or sorry, under-extraction from the part that got relatively less attention. And this is going to be confusing in your mind. And it's even more confusing to someone that you're training for the first time and you're trying to get them to figure out, how does espresso work? Okay, cool, we're going to taste for these things. If you're under-extracted, maybe you're a little sour, maybe you're a little tart, maybe you're a little salty. If you're over-extracted, maybe you're a little dry, bitter, astringent. And if you have someone who maybe they're an experienced taster, maybe they're a foodie, but they're new to espresso, even, and they have like a really well-developed palate, and they're like, well, I'm tasting both and I don't know what to do. Where do I go from here? I'm already doing the recipe that you said was good and the coffee tastes strange. So that is a problem. The other way that this can go bad is if we have something like this, and that is a coffee bed that's relatively evenly distributed, but it's got some sort of crack into it. For diagram purposes, the crack's in the middle, but really the most common place that you would see a crack is kind of along the side wall of the basket. As a side note, I'm pretty sure Jared's making Snapchat faces at me. Which I encourage, I highly encourage. Please keep going. Put them on the Cat and Cloud Instagram. And the same thing applies here, which is if you engage your pump and start to pump water through this coffee, the water is going to find that empty space because it's easier to go through, and you're going to get an uneven extraction. And again, you're going to get that discrepancy in taste, you're going to get that mixed feedback that doesn't match up to whatever recipe you want to do. It's just going to be a full-blown, ridiculous nightmare. And let's go back to here. So here are your options. Now, this is it's really easy to understand. If you look at a diagram like this, it makes instantaneous sense why you would prefer the one on the far right. Why the one with the most even density, most even distribution is going to produce the best extraction. And the idea of a recipe is also really, really simple. I put a certain amount of raw product in, I run a certain amount of water through it, I get a certain amount out over a certain time frame, and all these things result in flavors. And again, you don't need to know really anything about science or technology to be able to figure this out. But the really key piece is tying them together, and I think this idea here is kind of what's responsible for a lot of bad coffee that I've had in a lot of cafes. And this is something that comes up a lot, and we address it on our podcast a lot. And we've had a lot of talk about, I've been in the coffee industry for a really, really long time, so just for some framework is, when we started making espresso, we didn't really weigh the dose in. We used shot timers, but only sometimes. And we didn't weigh our output. We went on volume, and we went on visual cues. And while that's not ideal, it was something that we were kind of really proud of. I was very proud that I could walk up to any machine and through just tasting a couple shots, be able to produce espresso that tasted good. Then scales came around as being commonly used in a cafe, and scales are 100% absolutely a good tool. It's one of the most important tools I think that anybody who's going to brew coffee can have. And we've got these awesome new machines that have scales built in, and this is just amazing. It makes everything so much easier. But I started drinking coffee and going to places where people would weigh the dose, and they'd weigh the output, and they'd give me coffee, and it tasted horrible. And I talked to some friends of mine, and I'm like, hey, what's going on here? And they're like, yeah, I had the same experience. I went in, like, they weigh the shot, they weigh the thing, it tastes bad. And first I started like hating the idea of scales. I was like, scales are horrible. You should never use a scale to brew coffee because the coffee tastes bad when you use scales to measure it. And then I realized that, like, absolutely, of course that's not what's going on. It's not the scale's fault. And it wasn't even the barista's fault. It was the educators and the trainers' fault for not looking at the entire picture and not teaching that from the top down. So if I went into store X and I get a shot from a barista and they feel confident because they did exactly what their trainer told them to do. I put 19 grams of coffee in the portafilter, I got 33 grams out, and I did it in 27 seconds. This absolutely tastes perfect because this is what my trainer told me to do. She said it was super cool. This is the idea that's missing. So this recipe, while coffee might taste the most ideal at whatever you decide your recipe is, the recipe is only applicable if you have an even extraction. Because you can make whatever your recipe is happen in a variety of different ways. So I can make 19 in, 33 grams out at 27 seconds happen in a puck that's got uneven density. And even though the recipe is correct, the coffee is not going to taste good. I can do 19 in, 33 out at 27 seconds with a puck that's got a pinhole channel or a bunch of cracks through it. And even though the recipe says that the coffee should taste awesome, it still doesn't taste good because the extraction's not even. The only way that your recipe actually works is if it's combined with an even extraction, even density, even distribution. Then you're getting everything that you want out of the coffee. And this idea doesn't apply to only espresso. You can take this idea and apply it to any kind of method where you have coffee going through water. So the same idea would apply to a pour over, just in a much different, rate. You have much different recipes, but you still have that same philosophy. And you can take this idea and apply it to everything that you train and everything that you think about. It's not enough to just know what. You really, really, really need to know why. Why am I doing this? Why does this work? And I think as an industry, this is why we have a huge contingent of people that have these kind of knee-jerk reactions, myself included, to these new things. Scales is one of them. The other one is, the refractometer, or measuring your coffee's extraction percentage with like a VST apps. Amazing tool, but if we're gunning for just certain numbers at all costs because someone told us that we should hit those, and I'm at 20% at 1.25, and therefore all is good in my world and I can just go home happy, it just doesn't work like that. So I feel like this is almost like an illustration of something that we can apply to every issue. So when you're training, just make sure that you train the why behind the what, if that makes any sense. As far as things on the screen go, this is really all I have. What I kind of wanted to do was either talk to you as human beings in the form of a Q&A or do some maybe examples. Does anybody have any questions or ideas or thoughts that they wanted to share, challenges with training?
So,
Do you mind?
oh, no.
Yeah.
So you have these diagrams, and my biggest question is, from what you think in a practical setting, when we're doing espresso preparation, what are the main causes of the unevenness versus someone who's preparing an even extraction and still getting the same numbers, but the coffee tastes better? So what do you think are the main issues with all those two on the left?
Right. So we'll start here. I think the main offenders here are getting the coffee, like physically from the grinder and into the portafilter in a clean and consistent way. And then when it's there, redistributing it in some kind of way that works for you. So an example, I'm gonna go, will this reach over here? Can we make coffee? Yeah. Can I put this down? Yeah. Putting this down.
Never done this before. This is pretty sweet. My life has changed so much over time.
So this is coffee inside of a portafilter. And the thing that I'm looking at when I'm looking, oh, I spilled all over. What I see here is a bunch of coffee inside a portafilter, and there's a lot of coffee on one side of the portafilter, and there's relatively less coffee on the other side of the portafilter. And sure, we have redistribution, we have things like stock less, or we can use some sort of redistribution tool, or like tapping, and this can help even this out. And again, depending on what you do, you may have different results, but I'm a really big fan of, if you're using some sort of system like this, you've got a really cool little funnel here, is getting the coffee in the portafilter in the most uniform way possible from the get-go. So you have to do less work to even it out. And an example that I see a lot of the times is on bar, let's say maybe you have, like, I don't know, you've got your Rober E, you got your grinder timer there, and you can throw the portafilter under that grinder and it grinds out coffee for you. And you can either put it there, put it in a proper spot, pay attention to it, watch how the coffee's coming out, and over time learn where the coffee's going to be coming out and be really intentional about that. Or you can throw the portafilter on the fork and see the dude coming and go, oh dude, what's going on, what's up? And then you have this really, really sloppy mass of coffee. So that's phase one, is just like setting up the coffee in the portafilter as evenly as you can from the get-go. And then the second part of that is redistributing that coffee well. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. You can do tapping, you can do some sort of manual redistribution, or you can use a tool. And we've actually moved away from manual redistribution as of late. I think it's still a really cool thing to teach people. But if you have a business, which we do, what we're kind of looking for is the ability to take a lot of people from A to Z relatively fast, but also even the playing field. So if we can use a tool that gets us the exact same result every time, we're gonna do that. Those are the two most common offenders for the one on the left. Depending on how gnarly it is, you may have a discrepancy in like some sort of sideways or off-kilter tamp, but if it's minimal, it's not usually as bad as those two other things. So just paying attention to distribution. And with a lot of like the newer people, or even some of the home users I'd say, it's like you start with like a big pile like we had, all on one side. It obviously doesn't look good. They'll tamp it straight down, and then the bed of coffee is flat, so they think it's even, but in reality the density underneath that is not even, so you still get the uneven extraction. The one in the middle, the most common offender for that is just mishandling the portafilter. So once you've got your bed of coffee in there and you've tamped it, you don't need to treat it like a little tiny baby, but you do want to be kind of a little bit careful with it. So the number one is if you've got a puck of packed coffee and you're getting ready to go for it, and you're like, yeah dude, and you bang it all around trying to get it in the group bed, which it seems silly and like everybody laughs, but it happens again and again and again and again. I see it every time I go into cafes, people fumbling with it. And it could be here, it could be slamming it on the counter or doing whatever. Back in the day, it was always, tapping it with the tamper. Those are really easy ways to open that up. So I think those are the two worst offenders. Treat it like a special person that it is. Take care of it. Yeah.
What are things that you recommend as far as gear that will help make sure